My parents showed up at 3 o'clock on a sweltering afternoon with a notary, a box of pastries, and the smug looks of people claiming a guaranteed victory. My brother was already in the yard with a tape measure. I did not scream. I did not refuse. I signed the quitclaim deed so fast they thought they had finally crushed me. Instead, they stepped right into my most calculated and expensive trap. My name is Annika Pierce. I am 34 years old, and I spent the first 3 decades of my life playing the role of the reliable daughter. I am the one who fixes things. I am the one who absorbs the impact. But sitting in the living room of the corner bungalow I purchased entirely on my own in Marlow, Virginia, I realized my family did not see me as a person. They saw me as a resource. The ambush happened at 3 o'clock on a blistering Tuesday afternoon. The doorbell rang, a sharp sound that cut through the quiet hum of my air conditioning. When I opened the heavy oak front door, I found my parents and my younger brother standing on the porch. They had not called. They had not texted. They had simply arrived, armed and ready for a siege. My father, Robert Pierce, stood at the front of the pack. He possessed the rigid posture of a man who believed his mere presence commanded absolute obedience. Next to him was my mother, Linda. She held a bakery box tied with a white string, offering a tight, nervous smile that failed to reach her eyes. Behind them, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a racehorse waiting for the gates to open, was my brother Mason. He was 32, yet he still carried the reckless, consequence-free aura of a teenager. And then there was the stranger, a middle-aged woman in a faded gray suit, carrying a heavy leather tote bag and a brass stamp. I knew what she was the moment I saw her, even before my father pushed past me into the entryway. She was a notary. They did not ask to come inside. They occupied my home. My father marched straight to the dining table I had restored with my own hands. He did not ask about my day. He did not offer a greeting. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers, and slapped them down onto the polished wood. The sound was loud, blunt, and entirely devoid of respect. He looked at me with cold, expectant eyes. He told me that the family was going through a rough patch. He said Mason needed stability, a foundation to finally get his life on track. Then, using a tone that was not a request but a royal decree, he ordered me to sign the house over to my brother, just for a little while, he claimed, just to help him out. I stood frozen by the sheer audacity of the demand. I looked at the papers, then at the man who had supposedly raised me to be independent. He was asking me to hand over the single most valuable thing I had ever achieved. Before I could form a word, my mother stepped forward. She placed the pastry box on the kitchen counter and reached out to touch my arm. Her grip was gentle, but her words were laced with the same heavy guilt she had weaponized against me my entire life. She looked into my eyes and said that I had always been the strongest. She told me I was the capable one, the one who always landed on her feet. I had heard that exact phrase 1,000 times. You are the strongest. Annika. It was what they said when they forced me to empty my childhood savings account to pay for Mason to fix the car he wrecked. It was what they said when I had to skip my college graduation ceremony because Mason needed to be bailed out of a bad lease. Being the strongest was not a compliment in this family. It was a life sentence of carrying the weak. While my mother attempted to drown me in maternal manipulation, Mason could not even pretend to look remorseful. He was already pacing the length of my living room. I watched him pull a bright yellow tape measure from his jeans pocket. He extended the metal strip, snapping it against the baseboards. He looked up at the ceiling, narrowing his eyes, and then blurted out that he was going to tear down the wall separating the kitchen from the dining area. He said it would make the space more masculine. He said the floral wallpaper I had carefully chosen would have to go by the weekend. He was standing in my house, a house he had never contributed a single dime toward, already erasing my existence from it. In the past, I would have yelled. I would have argued until my throat was raw, begging them to see the unfairness of it all. I would have cried out of sheer frustration, desperately trying to make them understand how hard I worked for the roof over our heads. But I did not yell. I walked over to the dining table and pulled the document toward me. I turned the heavy pages one by one. The air in the room grew thick and still. The notary shifted uncomfortably near the front door. I read the legal jargon. It was not a temporary lease. It was not a shared equity agreement. It was a quitclaim deed. It was a complete and total transfer of ownership. They wanted me to erase my name from the title entirely and hand the property to Mason free and clear. My eyes scanned down to the property description, the block of text that defined exactly what piece of the earth was being transferred. I read the lot numbers. I read the boundary definitions. And right there, hidden in plain sight, I saw it, the mistake. It was a glaring, catastrophic error. They had used an outdated tax record to draft the deed. They thought they were taking everything. They had no idea what the county had done to the property lines 6 months prior. They had no idea they were only taking half the board and leaving me with the pieces that controlled the entire game. A strange, icy calm washed over me. It started in my chest and spread to my fingertips. The panic and the hurt evaporated, replaced by a crystalline clarity. They had finally pushed too far, but in their greed, they had become sloppy. I looked up from the quitclaim deed. I looked at my mother, who was wringing her hands in an act of theatrical anxiety. I looked at my brother, who was tapping his knuckles against my pristine drywall. Finally, I looked at my father, who was holding a blue ink pen toward me like a weapon. I did not throw the pen back at him. Instead, I leveled my gaze at him and asked a single question. My voice was entirely flat, devoid of any anger or sorrow. It was so cold that the entire room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I asked him, "If I sign this, the family will never take anything from me again, right?" My father did not hesitate. He did not pause to consider the weight of the promise. He simply nodded sharply and said, "Absolutely. This is the last time we will ever ask you for a favor." "Annika, you have my word as your father," he answered far too quickly. His immediate certainty told me everything I needed to know. This was not a sudden crisis. They had not come up with this plan overnight. They had been plotting this ambush for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to strip me of my sanctuary. They had already divided the spoils before they even knocked on my door. I took the blue pen from his hand. The notary stepped forward, her eyes wide, perhaps sensing the unnatural tension in the room. I flipped to the final page. I pressed the tip of the pen to the thick paper. I signed my name, Annika Pierce. I signed it smoothly, without a single tremor in my hand. The notary stamped the page, the heavy thud of brass against wood echoing through the silent dining room. The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous. The moment the notary handed the copies to my father, the heavy, oppressive tension lifted from their shoulders. My father let out a long breath, a triumphant smile breaking across his face. My mother practically sagged with relief, reaching out to squeeze my shoulder one last time. Mason actually clapped his hands together, his eyes darting toward the kitchen wall he was already planning to destroy. They packed up their victory quickly. They did not linger. They had gotten exactly what they came for, and they were eager to leave before I could change my mind or dissolve into tears. They walked out the front door, leaving the box of pastries behind on the counter like a cheap consolation prize. I stood in the entryway and watched through the front window as they piled into my father's sedan. I watched them pull away from the curb, driving down the tree-lined street of Marlow, absolutely convinced they had just won the lottery at my expense. The house fell completely silent again. I did not collapse onto the floor. I did not shed a single tear. I walked calmly back to the dining table, picked up my phone, and opened my messages. I selected the contact for Kira Sloan, my lawyer and my closest friend. My fingers moved quickly across the screen. I typed 3 simple words. Initiate step 2. I hit send. The screen confirmed the message was delivered. I set the phone down next to the forgotten pastry box, looking around the living room that my brother thought he now owned. They thought they had backed me into a corner and forced my hand. They had no idea I had been holding the winning cards all along. Let them enjoy their victory today. The bill was going to come due very, very soon. The silence left behind in the living room was heavy, yet it carried a familiar, bitter weight. I had spent my entire adult life navigating the quiet aftermath of my family taking whatever they needed from me to patch their own leaking ships. I work as a senior contract fraud review specialist at Harborline Claims Group. My daily professional existence revolves around finding the hidden truths buried deep within dense legal documents. I hunt for the loopholes, the strategic omissions, and the deliberate misrepresentations that greedy people use to exploit the system. I spend 40 to 60 hours a week analyzing the exact placement of a comma, the specific phrasing of an indemnity clause, or the subtle shifting of liabilities in commercial leases. That job is not just a mechanism to pay my bills. It is the rigorous training ground where I learn to survive the very people who share my bloodline. Securing this property took years of absolute, unwavering sacrifice. While my peers in their mid-20s were taking summer vacations to the coast or putting down payments on brand new vehicles, I was grinding through endless overtime shifts. I ate inexpensive meals cooked in a cramped, poorly insulated apartment. I skipped social events, birthdays, and weddings that required expensive travel or costly gifts. I funneled every spare dollar into a high-yield savings account, watching the numbers climb with a desperate, singular focus. This house was not handed to me by a generous relative. It was built from the ground up using very real, very American currency. It was forged from steady monthly salaries, a pristine credit score meticulously maintained over a decade, an immaculate loan history, and a level of financial discipline that bordered on sheer obsession. From the time I was a little girl, I was strictly trained to be the understanding one in the family dynamic, in the twisted vocabulary of my parents. Being understanding simply meant I was entirely on my own. It meant I paid my own university tuition by working double shifts waiting tables at a local diner until my feet bled and my back ached. It meant I bought my own highly unreliable used car and covered the exorbitant insurance premiums myself. If I made a mistake, if I bounced a check or failed an exam, I suffered the consequences alone in the dark. There was no safety net beneath me, no soft place to land when gravity took over. Mason, on the other hand, was the golden child who always needed just one more chance. My brother was an absolute master of the spectacular failure. He dropped out of his university program halfway through his sophomore year because the professors were supposedly too rigid and did not appreciate his unique vision. After that academic disaster came a long, exhausting string of short-lived entrepreneurial ventures. There was the premium mobile car wash business, which lasted exactly 4 months before he totaled the expensive commercial van he had bought on predatory credit terms. Then came the grand scheme to sell refurbished gym equipment, which ended predictably with a leased warehouse full of rusted iron and a broken commercial contract. Every single time Mason crashed his life into a wall. My parents were right there with an open checkbook and a fresh set of excuses. They drained their own retirement resources and delayed their own comfort to cushion his fall, always insisting that he just needed a little more runway to finally take off. Because I had absolutely no one standing behind me with a checkbook or a word of comfort, I became incredibly sharp. I became intensely private, guarding my life like a state secret. I learned very early that if I shared my successes with my family, they would immediately calculate how my newfound stability could be utilized to offset Mason and his endless vortex of chaos. I understood the devastating weight of a signature long before I ever sat for a mortgage closing. I knew that a poorly worded contract could ruin a life faster and more thoroughly than any physical weapon. My lack of a safety net transformed me into an armor-plated version of myself, someone who trusts nothing but the black and white text on a legally binding page. When I finally held the heavy brass keys to my home for the very first time, standing on the freshly painted front porch, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I swore to myself right then and there that I would never allow anyone to turn my sanctuary into a consolation prize for someone else and their chronic irresponsibility. I knew exactly how my family operated. I knew they believed my assets were merely an extension of their own emergency funds. In their minds, whatever I built was ultimately subject to a family tax whenever Mason inevitably needed a financial bailout. They viewed my success as their permanent backup plan, but my family never bothered to look closely at the things they coveted. They looked at my house, they looked at the neatly trimmed yard, and they assumed it was a single, indivisible prize. They did not pay attention to the county records. They did not understand the intricate mechanics of municipal zoning. Exactly 1 year ago, the local government initiated a massive infrastructure upgrade project throughout our neighborhood. The county was widening the municipal drainage systems and updating the aging electrical grid along the main avenues. Because my property sat squarely on a prominent corner lot, the county surveyors had to come out and redraw the legal boundaries to accommodate a new, permanent utility easement. During that tedious bureaucratic process, my real estate was legally severed into 2 completely separate parcels. Parcel A was the main residential structure. It included the front lawn, the porch, the living room with the floral wallpaper, the kitchen, and the bedrooms. It was the house, exactly as anyone driving by would define it. Parcel B was entirely distinct on the legal maps. Parcel B consisted of the renovated carriage house tucked into the back corner of the lot, the paved parking area, and the wide side access path that connected the driveway directly to the street. Anyone attempting to live in the main house absolutely needed that side access path to park a vehicle, receive a delivery, or even roll the garbage bins out to the curb for collection. My parents and my brother were completely oblivious to this legal split. They did not read public notices. To them, a house was simply a house. The physical wooden fence running along the perimeter dictated the boundaries of the kingdom in their minds. They assumed that because the property looked like one cohesive unit, it functioned legally as one single asset. They had spent their entire adult lives dealing in heavy emotions, in manufactured guilt trips, and in hasty financial band-aids. They never possessed the patience or the intellect to read the fine print. I realized a very long time ago that fighting them on an emotional battlefield was a guaranteed loss. If I yelled at them for being unfair, I was labeled the hysterical, ungrateful daughter who lacked family loyalty. If I pleaded with them to respect my boundaries, I was dismissed as being cold and selfish. The only way to permanently break their cycle of extortion was to stop playing their exhausting game of emotional tug-of-war. If I truly wanted to be free of them forever, I had to let them win the battle they thought they were fighting. I had to let them take exactly what they asked for upon that printed page. Nothing more and absolutely nothing less. I had to let them sign their own names to a disaster of their own meticulous making. I had to beat them using the very rules they thought they were manipulating to destroy me. I knew the precise catalyst for this sudden, aggressive invasion. It was never about a vague, undefined rough patch. Less than 72 hours before they marched up my front steps, my brother had detonated his newest catastrophic failure. It was a mobile luxury auto detailing franchise, a business model he had researched for exactly 1 weekend before deciding it was his path to instant wealth. He had funded the entire doomed enterprise with predatory hard money loans carrying exorbitant interest rates. He had completely ignored his quarterly tax obligations, treating the government like an optional subscription service. To make matters worse, he had financed heavy, commercial-grade cleaning equipment, industrial vacuums, power washers, specialized chemical stations on terrible, short-term credit. The business had collapsed spectacularly before he even managed to detail a single vehicle. The leased van broke down. The chemicals ruined the interior of his first test subject, and the hard money lenders immediately began circling. But this time, the blast radius was much wider than his usual contained disasters. My parents were not standing in my dining area out of pure, unconditional parental sympathy for their struggling son. They were terrified. They were sweating under their crisp clothes. I knew, through the grapevine of unpaid family favors, that they had secretly co-signed a massive financing agreement for all of that heavy machinery. They had put their own names on the dotted line. When my brother inevitably defaulted, which was no longer a possibility, but an impending reality, the aggressive corporate creditors would not stop at his empty, overdrawn bank accounts. They would legally and ruthlessly target my parents. They would place liens on their property. They would garnish their retirement funds. In their absolute panic to save their own comfortable, middle-class lifestyle, They had decided my home was the perfect sacrificial lamb. The grand family solution was to forcefully extract my property, place it entirely in my brother's name, and instantly provide him with a substantial paper asset. A house with zero debt attached to it was exactly what he needed. He could quickly leverage the property, secure a massive equity loan, and pay off the impending debt before the creditors ripped my parents' financial security to shreds. They desperately tried to sell the narrative that this was just about providing a temporary roof over his head, a quiet place for him to regroup and plan his next move. But the hypocrisy was suffocating, filling the room like thick smoke, and their staging was incredibly sloppy. I saw the aggressive reality hiding behind their practiced, worried expressions. You do not bring a professional, bonded notary to someone's house on a random Tuesday afternoon just to arrange a temporary stay in a spare bedroom. While my father was commanding me to sign the papers, wrapping his demands in the guise of family duty, I had watched my brother through the front window before he even crossed the threshold. He had been standing on the sidewalk, snapping wide-angle photos of the property facade with his smartphone. I watched his thumbs flying across the screen, immediately texting the images to his friends, visibly bragging about his new acquisition. He was measuring the windows before he even owned the glass. And then there was my mother. While she was softly rubbing my arm and feeding me lines about my inherent strength, I noticed a thick manila envelope peeking out of the side pocket of her expensive designer handbag. Printed right on the front, in her looping, careful handwriting, were the words, "House keys." They had brought a container for the surrender. They had packed for a permanent eviction. They fully expected me to walk out the door and never come back. When I actually read the heavy legal document my father had slammed onto the table, my eyes locked onto the specific property identification code buried in the dense paragraphs. The air in the room felt tight, heavy with their impatient breathing and the suffocating pressure of their silent demands, but my mind was completely, terrifyingly clear. They had pulled an antiquated property description from an old, unupdated municipal tax database. The paperwork legally transferred Parcel A. They were claiming the main structure, absolutely oblivious to the fact that they were legally marooning themselves. They were so blinded by their frantic need to steal my equity that they did not realize they were only taking the house, leaving the driveway, the parking, and the crucial side access completely out of the transaction. But the outdated legal boundary was not even the most lethal flaw in their stolen paperwork. As I stared at the dense, black text on the stark white page, my brain calculated a far more dangerous reality. This main structure was tightly bound by the town's historical home restoration initiative. When I first purchased and rehabilitated the property, I accepted a substantial municipal grant to preserve the original architecture of the porch and the exterior trim. That money came with a strict, ironclad owner-occupancy mandate. I was legally required to live in the primary residence for a specific duration of time to prove the grant was serving the community and not just flipping developers. There were exactly 11 months remaining on that strict compliance period. The rules were entirely unforgiving. Transferring the deed to another party right now, in this very moment, would act as an immediate, irreversible tripwire. It would automatically void the historical agreement and trigger a massive, immediate repayment of the entire municipal grant. The town would demand the money back in full, with heavy penalties, almost instantly upon recording the new deed. The urge to warn them was a phantom reflex, completely deadened by years of their relentless exploitation. I sat there at the table I had sanded and stained myself, breathing evenly, and chose absolute, profound silence. I let the suffocating pressure of their expectations wash over me, and I did not utter a single word of caution. I allowed them to continue believing they were orchestrating a brilliant, flawless victory. For the first time in my entire existence, I saw a path out of this suffocating family dynamic. It was a path that was completely legal, ruthlessly decisive, and utterly permanent. If I let them step into this trap of their own making, if I let them trigger the legal avalanches hidden in that paperwork, they would lose absolutely any moral or legal standing to ever demand another sacrifice from me. They would be crushed by their own greed. The moment the ink dried on the final page, the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. The oppressive weight vanished, replaced by a sickening, celebratory lightness. My brother walked over, his face flushed with unearned arrogance, and clapped his hand down heavily onto my shoulder. It was a patronizing, condescending gesture, as if he were granting me a pardon instead of stealing my livelihood. He told me not to worry about moving my things out too fast, graciously offering me 48 hours to pack up my entire life and vacate the premises. He smiled, a wide, empty smile that showed absolutely zero comprehension of the damage he was causing. But it was my father who delivered the final, most chilling blow of the afternoon. As he carefully folded the notarized documents, smoothing the creases with his thumb, and tucked them securely into the breast pocket of his jacket, he looked down at me. His expression was one of profound, genuine relief. He adjusted his collar, let out a long, heavy breath, and spoke. "Now you can live unburdened." That single, casually delivered sentence froze the blood in my veins. It was the absolute, undeniable confirmation of everything I had ever suspected about my place in this family. Live unburdened. He did not view this house as my hard-won achievement. He did not see the overtime hours, the skipped meals, or the relentless discipline it took to secure it. He viewed my home as a heavy load I was carrying on their behalf. To him, my financial stability was simply a shared family resource that I was selfishly hoarding. By taking it away, by forcing me to sign it over to his reckless son, he honestly believed he was relieving me of the stressful obligation of being the designated safety net. They never saw my success as mine. They saw it as theirs, temporarily and inconveniently stored under my name until they needed to make a withdrawal. I watched them walk out the door, their steps light and energetic. I listened to their voices carrying across the front lawn, already chattering excitedly about contacting loan officers and securing appraisals. They left me standing in the center of the room, breathing the quiet, conditioned air. They thought they had just secured their financial salvation and neatly solved their impending bankruptcy. They thought the absolute worst was over. They had absolutely no idea that the timer had just started ticking, and the bill was going to be catastrophic. Many months before my family ever showed up on my front porch with their demands, I had already mapped out the exact architecture of my defense. The moment the municipal government finalized the subdivision of my corner lot, I immediately booked a private meeting with Kira Sloan. Kira is not just my closest confidant. She is a ruthlessly efficient real estate attorney who treats property law like a competitive blood sport. We spent several long evenings in her downtown office, surrounded by sprawling county maps and thick binders of zoning regulations. I instructed her to scrutinize every single overlapping right, every tax obligation, and every municipal loophole that connected the newly separated parcels. Kira understood the assignment perfectly. She helped me establish a completely blind corporate entity. We filed the paperwork under the name Pierce Rowe Holdings Limited Liability Company. It was a sterile, corporate shield that effectively erased my personal name from the public registry of the secondary lot. Under Kira's guidance, I quietly transferred the absolute ownership of the back parcel into that holding company. That specific parcel contained the fully renovated carriage house, the paved parking lot, the standalone laundry facility, and most importantly, the only practical driveway that connected the main residential structure to the public street. Without legal access to that driveway, anyone living in the main house was essentially trapped. They would have no place to park a vehicle, no pathway for service deliveries, and no route to pull their garbage bins to the curb. My family had just claimed ownership of a castle completely surrounded by a moat that I owned, but the driveway was merely a logistical nightmare. The financial landmine I had carefully buried was far more destructive. The main structure was strictly bound by a municipal heritage preservation contract. When I first purchased the property, the town council awarded me a grant of nearly $92,000 to restore the original architectural features of the exterior. That money was not a gift. It was heavily conditional. The town required the property owner to maintain continuous primary residence in the home for a rigidly defined period. I knew with absolute certainty that the moment the county clerk recorded the transfer of the deed to my brother, that residency clause would be violently breached. The town would instantly claw back the $92,000. Furthermore, the transfer would immediately terminate the lucrative property tax incentives I had secured, forcing the new owner to pay the maximum commercial tax rate moving forward. I had known this day might come. About 8 months ago, a very aggressive commercial developer named Rowan Vale Development had flooded my mailbox with glossy brochures and unsolicited cash offers. They were attempting to acquire the entire corner intersection to construct a boutique medical office complex. Their acquisition manager had taken me to an expensive lunch and made his position incredibly clear. They had absolutely zero interest in buying a fractured piece of land. They needed the entire footprint, both the main house and the back lot, or the project was entirely useless to them. I politely declined their generous offer at the time. I was deeply attached to the home I had built. However, I did not throw away their contact information. I deliberately kept a friendly, open channel of communication with their acquisitions team. I cultivated that relationship as a silent emergency exit, a glass box to break just in case my family ever decided to turn my life into a bailout fund for my brother. The moment the taillights of my father's sedan vanished down the street, my execution phase began. I did not waste a single moment indulging in panic or betrayal. My mind was a steel trap snapping shut. I walked directly into my bedroom, pulled my largest suitcases from the top shelf of my closet, and began dismantling my life. Over the next 48 hours, I worked with the cold precision of a military operation. I systematically stripped the main house of anything that held actual financial value or deep personal significance. I carefully wrapped my collection of original paintings. I disconnected my premium electronics and packed away my expensive power tools. I gathered every single sensitive financial document, every bank statement, and every tax return. I rented a temperature-regulated storage unit on the opposite side of town under a different name and moved the bulk of my valuables there under the cover of darkness. The bare essentials for daily survival, my professional work clothes, my laptop, my toiletries, and my coffee maker, were quietly relocated into the carriage house tucked away on the back lot. The carriage house was small, but it was pristine, secure, and entirely shielded from the disaster I had just unleashed next door. Once the physical extraction was complete, the administrative avalanche commenced. I sat at the small kitchen island with my laptop glowing in the dim light, sipping black coffee as I severed my digital ties to the property. I logged into my insurance portal and canceled my comprehensive homeowner's policy, scheduling the termination to take effect the very second the new deed was legally recorded. I updated the mailing addresses for the Historical Society Compliance Board, the Municipal Water and Sewage Department, the local Property Tax Assessment Office, and the Neighborhood Association. I meticulously routed every single financial obligation, every legal warning, and every impending invoice directly to my brother. I changed the contact numbers on file to his mobile phone. I ensured that all future correspondence regarding the property would bypass me entirely. He was the proud new legal owner of the main house. I was simply making sure the entire bureaucratic system treated him exactly like one. I wanted the full weight of property ownership to crash down on him without any buffer. On my final night inside the main structure, the air felt strangely thin. I ordered a simple cheese pizza and sat directly on the bare hardwood floor in the center of the empty living room. The floral wallpaper I had spent 3 weekends hanging looked foreign without my furniture to anchor the space. Every slight movement echoed against the blank walls. I leaned back, resting my head against the cool drywall, and stared up at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. I waited for the crushing wave of sorrow to hit me. I waited for the familiar sting of tears that always followed my family's relentless betrayals. I expected to mourn the loss of the sanctuary I had poured my soul into, but my eyes remained completely dry. My chest felt incredibly light. As I looked around the hollow shell of the house, a profound, undeniable sense of peace settled deep into my bones. For the very first time in my 34 years of existence, I was not the victim of a robbery. I was not the tragic collateral damage of their endless toxic dysfunction. I had not surrendered. I was actively using their own breathtaking greed to permanently dismantle the parasitic family system that had drained the life out of me. Monday morning arrived crisp and bright, the kind of day designed for new beginnings. I watched from the obscured window of the carriage house as my brother pulled his rented compact car up to the curb. He swaggered up the front walk with the exaggerated confidence of a conquering general claiming his spoils. He had a brand new doormat tucked under his arm and a smug grin plastered across his face. He expected to walk into the cozy, meticulously decorated sanctuary he had always envied. He expected to find the plush rugs, the warm lighting, and the comfortable furniture that made the place feel like a home. Instead, he unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into a sterile, echoing void. I had left the premises immaculately clean. The hardwood floors were swept and polished, the windows were washed, and the countertops were wiped down. But I had surgically removed the soul of the house. The warmth he craved was gone, leaving behind only bare walls and the hollow sound of his own footsteps. His initial confusion quickly mutated into loud, explosive anger the moment he walked out the back door to inspect the rest of his supposed kingdom. I heard the sharp slam of the screen door. He marched toward the paved side parking area, fully intending to pull his vehicle off the street. He stopped dead in his tracks when he reached the property line. A fresh, bright orange line of surveyor paint marked the invisible boundary dividing the main structure from the driveway, the garage, and the carriage house. He stared at the detached garage, then down at the painted line, his brain struggling to process the visual evidence. To the naked eye, the corner lot appeared to be a single, unified estate. But the reality of the dirt beneath his feet was entirely different. He stormed back inside, his face flushed red with indignation, and found the thick manila envelope I had left sitting squarely in the center of the kitchen island. I had labeled it simply as the welcome packet. He tore it open, expecting perhaps a list of maintenance contacts or instructions for the thermostat. What he found instead were the heavy, ironclad obligations of a newly minted property owner. Tucked beneath the shiny brass keys to the front door was a certified copy of the Municipal Heritage Preservation Contract. I had helpfully highlighted the specific paragraphs detailing the strict residency requirements and the severe financial penalties for transferring the deed before the compliance period expired. He completely ignored the highlighted text. In his arrogant rush to capitalize on his new asset, he picked up his phone and immediately dialed a commercial lender. He was so eager to secure a massive equity line of credit to salvage his sinking business debts that he put the loan officer on speakerphone. Through the thin walls separating our parcels, I could hear the entire devastating conversation. My brother confidently described the property, quoting the bloated, inaccurate market value he had assumed the entire corner lot was worth. The appraiser on the other end of the line was brutally professional. The man clicked his keyboard, pulling up the freshly updated county records, and delivered a fatal dose of reality. He informed my brother that the value of the main residential structure was drastically lower than anticipated. A house stripped of its driveway, completely devoid of off-street parking, and legally separated from its auxiliary structures, was considered a severely compromised asset. The appraiser stated flatly that the practical usability of the site was so limited that no reputable bank would underwrite a substantial loan against it. The grand financial launchpad my family had envisioned was instantly reduced to a worthless pile of bricks and drywall. The suffocating reality of their mistake truly set in 2 days later. On Wednesday afternoon, the official certified mail from the town council arrived. The envelope was thick, heavy, and carried the seal of the municipal finance department. I watched from my vantage point as my father, who had stopped by to check on the progress of the grand scheme, retrieved it from the mailbox. He ripped the envelope open right there on the front lawn. I could see the exact moment the blood drained completely from his face. The letter was a formal, uncompromising demand for the immediate repayment of the $92,000 restoration grant. The town cited the sudden transfer of the deed as a catastrophic breach of contract. They demanded the funds in full within 21 days. Furthermore, The letter included a secondary notice from the county tax assessor. Because the property was no longer owner-occupied by the original applicant, the lucrative tax exemptions were permanently revoked. The property taxes were retroactively reassessed at the maximum commercial rate, and a supplemental bill was attached. My father looked like a man who had just stepped onto a landmine and heard the click. His shoulders slumped, the arrogant posture from the weekend completely vanishing. The house he thought was a lifeline was actually an anchor, and it was dragging them straight to the bottom. Less than an hour later, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter of the carriage house. It was my mother. I let it ring 3 times before calmly answering. Her voice was trembling, thick with manufactured tears and panicked disbelief. She bypassed any greeting and launched straight into a hysterical guilt trip. She demanded to know how her own flesh and blood could be so cruel. She sobbed into the receiver, asking how I could possibly treat my own family like complete strangers. She accused me of setting a malicious trap, of actively trying to destroy my brother and their retirement in one single, vindictive move. I listened to her entire frantic monologue without interrupting. When she finally ran out of breath, expecting me to apologize or offer a desperate solution, I kept my voice entirely neutral. I did not raise my tone. I did not let a single ounce of anger seep into my words. I simply stated a cold, undeniable fact. I told her that I had read the document they placed on my dining table. I told her I signed the exact piece of paper they brought into my home. I reminded her that they chose the notary, they drafted the deed, and they demanded my signature. I did not alter a single line of their legal request. I gave them precisely what they asked for, exactly as they asked for it. She sputtered, unable to formulate a coherent response because there was no logical defense against the truth. I ended the call quietly, severing the connection before she could start crying again. Next door, the nightmare was compounding by the hour. My brother was frantically calling insurance brokers, completely flustered by the realization that securing a new homeowner policy was an expensive, agonizing process. Because the property had changed hands, the old coverage was void. The new brokers required fresh inspections, and without the protective umbrella of the historical grant or a proven track record of maintenance, the premium quotes were astronomically high. Every single avenue he tried to take to convert the house into cash resulted in a dead end lined with aggressive fees and impossible requirements. The property was a financial black hole, swallowing every desperate idea he threw at it. As the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawn, I watched my father walk slowly out to the sidewalk. He stood alone in the fading light, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He turned around and stared at the brass house numbers mounted next to the front door. He stood there for a very long time, completely motionless. I knew exactly what was going through his mind. He was replaying the events of that Tuesday afternoon. He was remembering the way I sat at the table. He was remembering the way I took the pen without a fight. He was finally processing the utter lack of tears, the absence of any desperate pleading, and the chilling calmness of my demeanor. He was looking at the house, but he was finally seeing the trap. He realized that his daughter had not been defeated. She had not panicked when cornered. She had calmly, deliberately allowed them to lock themselves inside a burning building. And as he stood there in the quiet evening air, the terrifying realization washed over him that the person they had systematically underestimated for 34 years was the very person holding the only exit door. My brother was a creature of profound, almost breathtaking vanity. Even as the aggressive municipal demands and the frantic warnings from his short-term lenders piled up in messy stacks on the kitchen counter of his newly acquired house, he simply could not resist the overwhelming urge to project a public image of effortless, unearned success. He spent his afternoons posing on the front porch, snapping dozens of photos of himself leaning casually against the historic wooden pillars I had spent weeks restoring. He posted the pictures to his various social media accounts with incredibly arrogant captions, loudly boasting to his followers that he had just closed on a massive piece of prime real estate and was actively looking for aggressive investors to help him flip the property for a huge profit. He truly thought he was building a personal brand as a brilliant entrepreneur. In reality, he was happily providing beautifully documented, time-stamped evidence directly to the local government. The town compliance office monitored local real estate activity with intense scrutiny, especially properties intimately tied to their municipal preservation grants. Seeing a brand new owner publicly broadcast his clear intention to use a strictly protected residential home as a quick commercial flip was the exact equivalent of firing a bright red flare gun into the night sky. Within 48 hours of his ridiculous online boasting, a town inspector arrived completely unannounced. When I owned the main house, I maintained a meticulously documented timeline for the required heritage repairs, a pre-approved schedule that kept the city officials entirely satisfied. But when the deed transferred, that strict timeline transferred right along with it, falling directly into the hands of a man who could not even manage to wake up before noon on a weekday. The inspector walked the perimeter of the property, aggressively noting the slightly chipped paint on the original window frames, the minor structural sag in the front wooden steps, and the overgrown landscaping that I used to trim every single Sunday. The inspector issued immediate compliance orders. Every single citation carried a ticking clock and a heavy financial penalty if ignored. My brother simply took the yellow carbon copies and tossed them onto his growing pile of completely ignored obligations, entirely lacking the mental discipline required to manage a property that demanded constant, expensive attention. While my brother was actively drowning in municipal citations, my father attempted to salvage his deeply wounded pride by taking the offensive. He booked an expensive, private consultation with one of the most prominent real estate attorneys in the county, fully intending to sue me for what he called malicious fraud and the deliberate deception of his family. I heard the exact details about that disastrous meeting a few days later through Kira and her connections within the small-town legal grapevine. My father had marched into the plush office, sat in the expensive leather chair, and confidently spun a dramatic tale of a deceitful, cold-hearted daughter who had maliciously tricked her loving family into taking a worthless piece of property. The lawyer, a hardened veteran of ugly property disputes, simply held up the notarized copy of the quitclaim deed. He pointed a heavy finger at the paper and brutally cut my father off mid-sentence. The attorney explained, in terms so simple they were insulting, that the legal description on the document was crystal clear. The parcel codes were completely accurate according to the old tax map my father himself had utilized to draft the paperwork. The lawyer stated flatly that absolutely no one had forced my father to draft a flawed document, and no judge in the entire state would ever entertain a lawsuit against a woman who simply signed the exact piece of paper her family demanded she sign. The lawyer charged my father $400 for that single hour of humiliating reality and promptly showed him the door. With their legal threats instantly neutralized, my mother resorted to the only weapon she felt she had left in her arsenal. She launched a campaign of social destruction. She began frantically calling our extended relatives, determined to paint me as the ungrateful, vicious villain of their tragic family narrative. She sobbed heavily over the phone to my aunts and uncles, claiming I had callously abandoned my own flesh and blood in their darkest hour of need. But the audience she was attempting to manipulate had long since grown tired of her endless, repetitive act. A few of the older relatives, the people who had quietly and resentfully watched the blatant favoritism play out for over 30 years, finally snapped back at her. My Aunt Sarah sharply reminded my mother that while they were buying my brother his third vehicle after he recklessly totaled the first two, I was working double shifts at a diner just to buy my own college textbooks. They bluntly told her to stop making ridiculous excuses for a grown man and hung up the phone. The smear campaign completely collapsed before it even gained momentum, leaving my mother entirely isolated in her own manufactured victimhood. Across town, I sat at my desk at Harborline Claims Group, my professional focus entirely unbroken. I reviewed complex corporate contracts, flagged minor discrepancies, and drank my morning coffee as if nothing in the world had changed. The air around me was completely still, devoid of the constant, humming anxiety that had plagued my entire adult life. Kira walked into my office just before noon, carrying a thick stack of revised holding company documents. She paused, leaning against the doorframe, and studied my face with intense scrutiny. She asked me, her voice laced with genuine, deep concern, if I was suppressing my emotions. She worried that the massive shock of the betrayal was simply delayed, and that I was eventually going to break down under the immense psychological weight of what had happened. I looked up from my dual monitors and met her gaze directly. I told her that for the very first time in my life, I was not suppressing a single thing. I was not biting my tongue, and I was not swallowing my anger to keep the fragile family peace. I simply felt nothing but the profound, overwhelming quiet of someone who had finally stopped sprinting into burning buildings to save the exact people who were happily holding the matches. But Kira had not just come to my office to check on my mental state. She stepped inside, firmly closed the heavy wooden door behind her, and sat down in the chair opposite my desk. She placed a thin manila folder onto the polished wood. Her expression shifted from concerned friend to ruthless attorney. She had spent the entire morning digging through the county civil dockets, tracking the legal fallout of my brother's spectacularly failed mobile detailing business. What she found was a terrifying, rapid escalation. The predatory hard money lenders holding the notes on his commercial equipment were not just circling my brother anymore. They knew his bank accounts were entirely empty. They had officially filed preliminary motions to execute the personal guarantees attached to the loans. Kira opened the folder and pointed a pen directly at a specific legal filing. The aggressive lenders were actively preparing to attach massive financial liens to my parents' primary residence. The debt was so incredibly high, and the default was so absolute, that my parents were merely weeks away from facing foreclosure on the home they had comfortably lived in for over 3 decades. The air in my office suddenly felt freezing cold. The scattered puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind, forming a picture far more sinister and calculated than I had originally allowed myself to imagine. The ambush in my dining room was never simply about providing my brother with a temporary stepping stone or a place to sleep. It was a desperate, highly coordinated act of total self-preservation. They were intentionally using my home as a human shield. They desperately needed my hard-earned equity to pay off the massive debt they had foolishly co-signed. They were actively hoping to save their own comfortable retirement at the exact, total cost of my entire financial future. I stared down at the terrifying legal paperwork, the sheer, breathtaking magnitude of their betrayal settling heavily onto my chest. But Kira was not finished delivering the bad news. She leaned forward, resting her elbows directly on my desk, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. She connected the final, most horrifying dot of their master plan. She explained that if my parents were truly on the brink of losing their own home to the relentless creditors, they never actually intended for my brother to live in my house alone. If they had successfully stolen the entire property like they planned, they would have quickly sold their own foreclosed house for whatever pennies they could get, or simply let it go back to the bank entirely, and then they would have packed their own bags. They were planning to move into the main house right alongside him. They did not just want to take my financial safety net, they wanted my exact physical address. They wanted my living room. They wanted my kitchen. They wanted to take the exact life I had meticulously built with my own 2 hands, move themselves permanently inside it, and force me to continue funding their chaotic existence from whatever small, insignificant corner they generously allowed me to occupy. The suffocating realization gripped my throat like a physical hand. They had not just come for my property that sweltering Tuesday afternoon. They had come for my entire life, fully and arrogantly expecting me to simply step aside and hand it over without a fight. The truth did not arrive in a single, explosive confrontation. It seeped into my life through a series of careless, bureaucratic mistakes and digital breadcrumbs left behind by people who were far too arrogant to cover their tracks. Because my carriage house shared a very similar mailing address to the main structure. The postal carrier occasionally made errors. Late one afternoon, I found a thick, heavily branded envelope resting inside my mailbox. It was addressed to my father, sent from a massive, predatory lending institution, but it carried the property address of my former home. I did not open it. I did not have to. I simply held it up to the harsh light of my kitchen pendant lamp and read the bold, capitalized warnings printed clearly across the thin paper of the enclosed notice. I took the envelope directly to Kira. She utilized her legal access to the county clerk's database to pull the public filings associated with my parents and their primary residence. What she uncovered was a financial autopsy of a family drowning in their own deceit. The disastrous equipment loan my brother took out for his mobile detailing business was merely the final nail in the coffin. The actual bleeding had started nearly 1 year ago. My parents had secretly taken out a massive, high-interest equity line against their own retirement portfolio to fund a previous, equally foolish venture my brother had pitched to them. They were currently 90 days delinquent on those payments. Kira also managed to intercept a frantic voicemail my brother had left for one of his aggressive creditors on a forwarded digital line he had stupidly linked to the main house address. In the recording, his voice was thin and panicked, begging for a 30-day extension and promising that his parents were about to liquidate a major real estate asset to cover the entire spread. The picture became terrifyingly clear. They were entirely out of runway. They had seriously discussed putting their own home on the market to escape the crushing weight of the debt they had incurred on his behalf. But instead of facing the consequences of their financial enabling, they looked across town at the quiet, stable life I had built and decided my sanctuary was the perfect life raft. The ambush with the notary was not a sudden act of panic. It was a highly orchestrated, deeply calculated extraction. The financial theft was brutal, but the psychological betrayal was the knife that cut the deepest. During her deep dive into the legal discovery process, Kira had subpoenaed some of my brother's communications related to his fraudulent loan applications. Buried within a massive PDF of text message transcripts, she found a conversation he had with a friend just 2 weeks before they showed up on my porch. His friend had asked what he was going to do about the angry investors. My brother had replied with complete, sickening confidence. He typed that he was just going to take over his sister's place. When the friend asked how he was going to pull that off, my brother wrote that Annika always softens up at the last minute. He did not see me as a sibling. He did not see me as a human being with a life, an independent future, or feelings. He viewed me as a highly reliable, emotionally vulnerable rescue mechanism that could be activated with just the right amount of family pressure. Suddenly, a seemingly innocent memory from the previous summer snapped into sharp focus. I had been weeding the front flower beds while my mother chatted over the fence with Mrs. Higgins, our elderly neighbor. Mrs. Higgins had complimented the extensive restoration work I was doing on the porch. I heard my mother laugh, a light, airy sound, and tell the neighbor that it was certainly a lot of work, but it was fine because the house would eventually return to the family anyway. At the time, I had dismissed it as my mother's bizarre way of claiming credit for my achievements. Now, sitting in Kira's office and looking at the undeniable proof of their premeditated scheme, I understood the dark reality behind those words. In her mind, my ownership was never absolute. My independence was just a temporary phase they were tolerating until they needed to cash out my equity. I felt a profound, aching hollow in my chest. I did not cry over the lost money. I did not mourn the physical house. I grieved the final, absolute death of the illusion that I had a family who loved me. They had not panicked. They had calmly sat around a table, assigned themselves roles for the Tuesday ambush, and chosen the exact moment to apply maximum pressure, treating my financial ruin as an acceptable, natural cost of keeping my brother comfortable. Kira closed the heavy file folder and folded her hands over it. She looked at me with a rare expression of sympathy softening her usually sharp features. She softly suggested that we could stop the bleeding right now. She explained that because I held the absolute upper hand with the control of the second parcel in the driveway, I could force them to the negotiating table immediately. I could offer a fractional settlement, buy out the most aggressive lien to save my parents from immediate homelessness, and make the entire nightmare go away quietly. It would be an expensive mercy, but it would prevent them from total public ruin. I looked out the large window of her office, watching the busy street below. I thought about the 34 years I had spent apologizing for things I did not do and paying for mistakes I did not make. I thought about the fake tears my mother had weaponized and the cold, entitled way my father had ordered me to surrender my safety, I turned back to Kira and told her no. I refused the settlement. I did not refuse out of a chaotic, burning desire for revenge. I refused because throwing them a lifeline right now would be the ultimate confirmation that they were right about me all along. If I saved them, I would validate the text message my brother sent. I would prove that I was exactly what they engineered me to be, a perpetual victim who always softened up at the last minute. I had to let them hit the absolute bottom of the concrete floor they had jumped toward. Instead of negotiating with terrorists, I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick, embossed business card of the acquisitions manager at Rowan Vale Development. I dialed the number right there in Kira's office. When the executive answered, I did not sound desperate. I sounded like a corporate strategist. I informed him that I was not ready to sell my parcel today, but I strongly advised him to keep his investment capital highly liquid and ready to deploy. I told him that the main corner lot they so desperately wanted was currently entirely controlled by a highly distressed, legally trapped owner who was about to face a massive municipal lien. I promised him that if the primary parcel fell back into my hands through a foreclosure or a forced surrender, I would be ready to package the entire corner and sell it to him in one massive, seamless transaction. The executive was practically vibrating with excitement by the time I hung up the phone. I was keeping the emergency exit wide open, entirely on my own terms. That evening, the temperature dropped, bringing a crisp, biting chill to the air. I stepped out of the carriage house and walked down the paved driveway that I legally owned. I stopped right at the bright orange surveyor line painted on the asphalt. I stood entirely within the borders of the secondary parcel, the only piece of the earth my family could not touch, manipulate, or steal. I looked over at the dark, silent windows of the main house where my brother was currently hiding from his creditors. The air was completely still. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold night air, and for the very first time in my entire life, I spoke the absolute truth out loud to the empty driveway. I do not owe them another inch. The clock was bleeding out rapidly, with less than 14 days remaining before the municipal grant repayment became a hard, legally enforceable penalty. The dynamic of the opposition completely fractured. My father, realizing his booming authoritarian commands were entirely useless against a brick wall of legal documentation, attempted a clumsy pivot. He called me on a Thursday evening, stripping the dictator from his tone and replacing it with the slippery cadence of a desperate bargainer. He proposed a compromise. He asked me to draft a formal agreement to let my brother lease the secondary parcel, specifically the driveway and the parking area, from my holding company. He argued that restoring functional access to the property would instantly elevate the market value of the main house, allowing everyone to walk away whole. I stood in the narrow kitchen of the carriage house, watching the rain hit the window pane, and refused his offer without a single second of hesitation. I knew exactly how the mechanics of my family operated. If I yielded even a fraction of an inch, if I signed a lease or offered a temporary parking pass, they would immediately interpret that concession as a signal that the ice was thawing. They would see it as proof that I was slowly sliding back into my designated role as the perpetual safety net. A lease would mean missed payments, excuses, and eventually, a grueling legal eviction process that would drag me right back into their chaotic orbit. I told him the property lines were permanent and severed the connection. When diplomacy failed, my brother resorted to erratic desperation. He called me at midnight a few days later, his words slurring slightly, completely abandoning the arrogant persona he had paraded around the neighborhood. He launched into a vicious, tearful tirade, aggressively blaming me for systematically destroying his bright future. He accused me of holding him hostage out of pure spite. Then, executing a pivot so brazen it genuinely stunned me, he wiped away his manufactured tears and pitched a brand new business model. He shamelessly suggested that I liquidate my own personal savings and co-invest in the property with him. He wanted me to fund a rapid renovation of the kitchen and bathrooms so we could flip the house together like a real family. The sheer, breathtaking delusion required to ask the person you just robbed to finance your getaway car was almost impressive. I ended the call and permanently blocked his number. My mother, realizing phone calls were ineffective, opted for a highly calculated physical ambush. She did not scream or threaten. She drove across town and waited in the corporate parking lot of Harborline Claims Group at the end of my shift. When I walked out of the heavy glass doors into the biting evening wind, she was standing next to my vehicle. She looked intentionally small, wearing a thin sweater, playing the devastating role of the heartbroken matriarch to absolute perfection. It was an emotional stabbing designed to break my resolve in public. She looked up at me with watery eyes and asked how I could abandon the people who loved me. I stood on the cold asphalt, clutching my laptop bag, and looked directly into her face. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure every single word landed like a physical blow. I told her that in our family, love was a transactional currency. I told her straight to her face that my definition of love no longer meant handing over my bank accounts, my property, or the rest of my natural life to patch up the endless destructive holes my brother continuously punched in his own existence. Her fake tears instantly stopped, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. I unlocked my car, got inside, and drove away, leaving her standing alone in the empty lot. The emotional failures triggered a final, desperate legal threat. My father had a frantic attorney send a threatening letter, promising to sue my holding company for intentionally obscuring the property lines and maliciously destroying the asset value of the main structure. Kira did not even blink. She drafted a brutal surgical response on her heavy corporate stationery and fired it back. She methodically analyzed the timeline, pointing out that I had absolutely zero legal or moral obligation to guarantee the market value of an asset after executing a completely legal transfer that they had specifically demanded, drafted, and provided. She reminded his lawyer that the legal doctrine of buyer beware applies heavily when the buyer brings their own notary and their own flawed paperwork to the transaction. The suffocating pressure finally cracked my brother wide open during a rare, face-to-face encounter at a neutral, downtown coffee shop. I agreed to the meeting only because Kira sat right beside me in the leather booth. My brother looked completely hollowed out. He spent the first 20 minutes spinning a tragic, exhausting narrative about just needing a stable roof over his head to get his life back on track. But his fragile ego could not handle Kira's cold, logical dismantling of his options. When she calmly explained that the driveway was a permanently separated commercial asset, he lost control. He slammed his fist onto the small wooden table, rattling the ceramic coffee mugs. In his blind, explosive anger, he slipped up completely. He yelled loudly that he never even wanted to live in the stupid house in the first place. He aggressively confessed that his actual plan was to flip the main residential structure within 30 days, take a massive cash payout from a desperate buyer, and cycle the money directly to his aggressive creditors to save the family from total bankruptcy. The background noise of the coffee shop completely faded away. That single, reckless confession was the final key turning in the lock. It instantly validated every single defensive measure I had ever taken. I finally understood that all the dramatic tears, the endless pleading, and the solemn speeches about a brother desperately needing a permanent home were nothing but a meticulously rehearsed script. It was a theatrical performance designed solely to manipulate me into surrendering a highly liquid asset just long enough for him to strip mine it for cash. They never cared about the house. They only cared about the exit strategy it provided. The climax of their panic coincided with a massive, silent shift in the local real estate board. Later that exact same afternoon, a courier delivered a sealed, heavily insured package to Kira at her office. It was a brand new, highly confidential preliminary letter of interest from Rowan Vale Development. The commercial landscape of our district had shifted violently overnight. A massive national pharmacy conglomerate had just finalized the purchase of the 2 large properties directly adjacent to my corner. That sudden corporate acquisition transformed my specific intersection into the most vital, strategic, and heavily desired commercial footprint in the entire town. Rowan Vale was no longer casually interested. They were aggressive. The new figures printed on the heavy paper were astronomical, completely dwarfing their original offer from 8 months ago. But the offer carried one massive, non-negotiable condition. They stated that if I could successfully reacquire the absolute title to the main residential structure before the municipal government initiated a forced tax lien sale, they were prepared to close on the combined parcels immediately with a massive, unconditional cash premium. The trap I had set had not just caught the thieves, it had miraculously turned the bait into solid gold. The chessboard was fully set, my pieces were locked in an impenetrable formation, and the people who thought they could ruin me were completely out of moves. The countdown was no longer a theoretical threat looming in the distance. It was a physical weight pressing down on the main house, crushing the last remnants of my brother's arrogant delusions. He could not produce the $92,000 required to repay the municipal heritage grant. His frantic calls to regional banks and shadow lenders yielded nothing but flat rejections. No legitimate financial institution was going to underwrite a loan for an unemployed man offering a legally landlocked, partially amputated property as collateral. Desperate, he tried to list the house on the open market at a massive discount, hoping to lure in a cash buyer looking for a quick flip. But real estate investors are not entirely stupid. Every single interested party pulled the county maps, saw that the primary structure was completely severed from the driveway and the parking lot, and immediately walked away. The house was a deformed, high-risk asset, completely paralyzed by the invisible boundary line separating it from my carriage house. When the 21-day grace period officially expired, the local government did not hesitate. The town finance office immediately initiated the process to place a heavy municipal lien directly onto the property deed. A lien of that magnitude is essentially a legal chokehold. It meant the town now held the first right to force a public auction of the house to recover their stolen grant money, because the situation involved a historic preservation contract and threatened to disrupt the surrounding neighborhood values. The county mandated an emergency mediation session before the heavy machinery of a forced foreclosure could officially begin. The mediation took place in a sterile, windowless conference room inside the municipal annex building. The air was stale, smelling faintly of old coffee and industrial floor cleaner. I arrived exactly on time, walking shoulder to shoulder with Kira. I wore a tailored gray suit, carrying nothing but a slim leather portfolio. There was no anger left in my chest. There was no burning desire to hurl insults or demand apologies. I was there simply to execute the final phase of a highly calculated corporate transaction. My family was already seated on the opposite side of the long mahogany table. My mother was wringing her hands, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. My brother looked physically ill, staring down at his empty hands. But my father sat rigidly in the center chair, his chin tilted upward. Despite standing on the absolute brink of total financial ruin, he still clung desperately to the delusion that he held the upper hand. He believed, down to his very marrow, that I had only pushed things this far to teach them a lesson. He fully expected me to slide across the table at the 11th hour, offer a tearful apology for causing so much stress, and open my checkbook to save the family reputation. He was waiting for the obedient daughter to return. He opened his mouth to speak, likely to deliver a stern lecture about family unity and forgiveness, but Kira did not even let him draw a full breath. She opened her briefcase, pulled out a single stack of freshly printed legal documents, and slid them precisely into the center of the table. I looked directly at my father and laid out the only option they had left. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the flat, emotionless cadence of a bank teller explaining a routine deposit. I told them that my brother would immediately sign a new deed, transferring the absolute title of the main house back to Pierce Rowe Holdings Limited Liability Company. In exchange for the property, I would use the substantial, non-refundable earnest money deposit I had just secured from Rowan Vale Development to completely pay off the municipal lien. I would satisfy the town, halt the foreclosure, and instantly dissolve the legal nightmare my brother had created. My father let out a short, dismissive scoff, reaching for the papers as if I were offering a pathetic compromise. But I raised my hand, stopping him cold. I told him that the house and the lien were just the logistics. The actual price of my intervention was located on the final page. I explained that in order for me to release the funds and save them from a public, humiliating bankruptcy, both of my parents had to sign a permanent, ironclad financial severance agreement. The document explicitly stated that I had absolutely zero financial, legal, or moral obligations to my father, my mother, or my brother. It covered the present day and extended into perpetuity. It legally barred them from ever claiming me as a dependent, from ever attaching my name to their debts, and from ever seeking alimony, support, or housing assistance from me for the rest of their natural lives. I was buying my absolute freedom, and they were going to put it in writing. The reaction was instantaneous and chaotic. My mother let out a sharp gasp, burying her face in her hands and breaking into loud theatrical sobs. My father slammed his fist onto the table, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He shouted that I was a monster, accusing me of trying to tear the family apart over a few dollars. My brother, suddenly finding his voice, pointed a shaking finger at me and spat out that I was totally cold-blooded. He accused me of weaponizing paperwork to destroy my own blood relatives. Kira leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. Her eyes were completely devoid of sympathy. She looked at my brother and quietly reminded him that I was simply sitting in my own home a few weeks ago, minding my own business, when the three of them marched through my front door with a notary and a fraudulent deed. She stated clearly that they were the ones who brought the paperwork to the fight, and I was simply the one finishing it. My father, blinded by his own toxic pride, violently shoved the documents back across the table. He declared that they would never sign such an insulting, degrading contract. He arrogantly proclaimed that they did not need my money, insisting they could simply find a private investor or secure a bridge loan by the end of the week. He ordered my mother and my brother to stand up, and the three of them stormed out of the mediation room, leaving the unsigned papers resting on the polished wood. I did not try to stop them. Kira simply gathered the documents and placed them back into her briefcase. We both knew their defiance was operating on a rapidly expiring timer. Their grand illusion lasted exactly 4 hours. Later that same afternoon, while they were frantically calling every contact in their phones, the local title insurance company delivered the fatal, undeniable blow. My father had managed to find a shady, high-interest lender willing to look at the house, but the lender required a clean title insurance policy before releasing any funds. The title company ran the updated property lines and immediately issued a hard, permanent denial. They explicitly stated over a recorded conference call that absolutely no underwriter in the state would ever insure a primary residence that lacked legal access to a public road. Without the secondary parcel, the main house was essentially a deserted island. There was no hidden investor. There was no secret bridge loan. The entire financial world looked at the trap they had walked into and slammed the door in their faces. The final scene of that long, agonizing day played out in the dim, quiet hallway outside the secondary mediation office, where the town had demanded we return before the close of business. I stood near the elevators with Kira, waiting for the final deadline to approach. Down the hall, sitting alone on a hard wooden bench beneath a flickering fluorescent light, was my father. His aggressive posture was completely gone. His shoulders were slumped forward, and his hands hung loosely between his knees. He was staring blankly at the beige linoleum floor. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life controlling his environment by manipulating the emotions and the finances of his daughter. He had always relied on my compliance, my guilt, and my desperate need for his approval. Sitting on that bench, surrounded by the silent, crushing weight of his impending ruin, the truth finally broke him. He realized, with absolute and terrifying clarity, that the greatest source of power he had ever possessed, his ability to force me to yield, was completely and permanently dead. The second mediation session felt like sitting inside a rapidly shrinking room. We were operating in the final hour. We had exactly 60 minutes before the county clerk closed for the day, and the town officially cemented the municipal lien onto the property. Once that bureaucratic hammer fell, the foreclosure would become public, permanent, and entirely irreversible. The silence in the windowless municipal conference room was incredibly thick, pressing heavily against the eardrums of everyone sitting around the long mahogany table. Mason was the very first one to break. The arrogant, careless boy who had swaggered onto my front porch weeks earlier was completely gone, evaporated by the harsh heat of the real world. In his place sat a terrified, exhausted man staring directly into the terrifying abyss of unshielded consequences. He looked up at me across the polished wood, his eyes hollow and dark. He did not speak like a victor who had been temporarily inconvenienced by a stubborn sibling. He spoke like someone who, for the very first time in his 32 years of existence, realized he could no longer survive by consuming the lifeblood of his sister. Without uttering a single word, he reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the deed transfer document toward his chest. Before my brother could pick up the blue ink pen, my father made one final, desperate lunge to maintain his illusion of control. He leaned forward, his face tight with bitter resentment, and fired his last pathetic bullet. He told me I was aggressively destroying my own flesh and blood just to soothe my bruised ego. He stated that I was tearing our family apart over sheer, petty pride. I met his glare without blinking or looking away. I did not raise my voice, but I delivered my response with the heavy, undeniable force of a falling gavel. "No," I replied, my voice steady and completely cold. "I am simply putting an end to this entire family calling exploitation love." That single sentence permanently shattered whatever fragile delusion was left hovering in the room. My mother, who had spent her entire adult life smoothing over my father's rough edges and actively enabling my brother's highly destructive habits, finally grasped the catastrophic reality of their situation. She fully understood that if they walked out of this room without signing those exact papers, Mason would not just lose the stolen house. The aggressive commercial creditors would immediately pivot, sinking their teeth deep into her own retirement accounts and forcing the entire family into a highly publicized, deeply humiliating bankruptcy. She reached out, took the pen directly from my brother's hand, and pulled the financial severance agreement toward herself. Her hand shook violently as she pressed the pen to the heavy paper, but her eyes were entirely clear. She signed away her right to my future because it was the absolute only way to save her present. Mason signed immediately after her, hastily scratching his name onto the property transfer, formally surrendering the trapped house back to my holding company. That left my father. He sat completely frozen, staring down at the signature line that formally demanded his absolute surrender. The moment he finally picked up the pen must be recorded not as a loud, explosive screaming match, but as a profound, silent internal collapse. For my father, the most agonizing defeat in that room was not the loss of a highly valuable piece of real estate. His ultimate devastating failure was the absolute loss of command over the daughter who had always served as his reliable, obedient subordinate. He signed his name slowly, the harsh scratch of the pen echoing loudly in the quiet room. In that exact moment, the dictatorial power he had wielded over my life for 34 years evaporated into thin air. We walked out of the municipal building as complete strangers, going our separate ways in the parking lot without a single glance backward. The very second the deed for the main house was legally recorded back into the name of Pierce Row Holdings Limited Liability Company, Kira and I executed the final, masterful stroke of the entire operation. My family had spent the entire grueling ordeal fighting over the absolute right to live in that house. They naturally assumed that my ultimate goal was to aggressively evict them, reclaim my property, and move right back into my carefully decorated living room. They severely underestimated the vast scope of my vision. I did not keep the house. That was the ultimate, crushing twist they never saw coming. The property had been permanently tainted by their breathtaking greed. It was no longer a safe sanctuary. It was the physical crime scene of their emotional theft. Before the ink was even fully dry on the town's official lien release, Kira activated the aggressive, non-negotiable contract we had prepared with Rowan Vale Development. We legally merged the newly recovered main parcel with the driveway and the carriage house, unifying the property back into a single, massive commercial footprint. We sold the entire strategic corner lot to the corporate developers for an astronomical, completely unconditional cash sum. It was a staggering amount of money, a massive financial valuation that my family lacked the basic business acumen to ever comprehend, let alone successfully negotiate. I took the massive profits from the corporate buyout and completely erased my footprint from the town of Marlow. I moved 2 towns over, settling into a quiet, heavily wooded neighborhood where no one knew my history. I purchased a beautiful modern home outright, paying 100% of the purchase price in pure cash. I had absolutely no mortgage, no debt, and no financial ties to anyone but myself. With a significant portion of the remaining funds, I established a permanent vocational scholarship program. I named it after my late grandmother, the absolute only person in my entire bloodline who had ever looked at me and genuinely believed I deserved to live a life that was not entirely drained and exhausted by the endless needs of others. The fund was specifically designed to help young women secure their own specialized trade licenses, ensuring they could build their own independent wealth without relying on anyone else. The brutal high-speed collision with reality finally forced my family into the exact lives they actually deserved, stripped completely of his permanent safety net. Mason had absolutely no choice but to face gravity. He quickly abandoned his ridiculous entrepreneurial fantasies and finally secured his very first stable, 40-hour-a-week job managing inventory at a regional logistics warehouse. My parents barely managed to avoid the forced foreclosure on their own home, heavily restructuring their debts and significantly downsizing their comfortable lifestyle to cover the massive financial damage they had caused. They still had a life to live, but they no longer possessed the golden key to my bank accounts, my property, or my pity. The endless well they had selfishly drawn from for over 3 decades was permanently cemented shut. My brand new life began on a very quiet Tuesday evening. I stood on the front porch of my new home, breathing in air that smelled of pine needles and fresh rain. I slid the brass key into the heavy front door and turned the lock. As the door swung open, I was not greeted by the sound of dramatic sobbing. I was not met with desperate pleas for financial salvation or heavy guilt trips disguised as maternal concern. I stepped over the threshold into absolute, breathtaking silence. It was the beautiful, sacred quiet of a woman who had finally forced her abusers to learn the agonizing lesson she had carried on her own shoulders for 34 long years. I looked around my empty, peaceful living room and smiled. I had finally proven the ultimate truth. Love is not a quitclaim deed. Love is not an endless string of forced financial bailouts. And being the strongest one in the family no longer meant being the one who had to lose absolutely everything just so the others could find it incredibly easy to survive. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on this video, and support me even further by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.